To the third in our apprenticeship webinar series. Today's webinar is a funding update on the apprenticeship reforms. So before I introduce our main speaker, Bryony Kingsland, I'd just like to explain a few things about today's webinar platform. All viewers will be in listen-only mode, and to engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panel. You'll see on the right-hand side of that panel, there's a little tab that says questions. As Bryony's going through the webinar, if you do have questions you'd like to submit, please send them in, and we'll be going through them and receiving them during the webinar, and then we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes at the end to answer all of those questions. So please don't forget to use that, and we'll remind you again later when we come to the Q&A session. You can also use the panel on the right-hand side to adjust the audio sessions, and we'll turn on the webcam when we do the Q&A. During the webinar, we will also be running a number of polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. After the webinar, we will be providing a recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides, and a fact sheet to address any unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and I'd like now to hand you over to our presenter, Bryony Kingsland.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin, we'd like to ask one poll question. So we've got the agenda here. Thank you. This is the agenda. So we're going to cover some of the key dates for funding information because we have some information which is imminent. I'll do an apprenticeship levy update, which is an overview of what's happening with the levy. There is some new information in there which will be interesting to both providers and to employers. Then I'm going to cover the new register to access apprenticeship funding, which the Skills Funding Agency has recently announced, and we received some new information, expanded information on that register last Friday. I'm going to cover any funding changes in the levy because some funding changes have been announced. And then I will do a very quick overview of the apprenticeship funding process. That is how providers and employers work together to enable the instigation of an apprenticeship and how both providers and employers interact with that funding process to ensure the funding goes where it's meant to. And then finally, as Belinda said a moment ago, we'll end with a question session, which I hope you're all bound to have questions on, so we'll try and give as much time for that as we possibly can. So before we begin, we do have a poll question that we'd like you to answer if you would. This is the poll question. How would you describe your understanding of the apprenticeship funding reforms so far? And the three answers you can click on are very good, good, know a little, do not know anything at all. So if you could answer that poll now, that would be really helpful for us. Great. Okay, thank you everybody. So the outcome of that is 57% of you know a little, 37% have a good overview, only 5%, I think, is that what it says? 5% have very good overview, and 6% do not know anything at all. So great, thanks everybody for your input on that. So without... Everybody still hear us? Hopefully yes. Okay. So apprenticeship levy update. As most of you will all know that the levy is going to be 0.5% of an employer's pay bill, and that's for any employer over a 3 million pay bill. That's only actually between 97 and 98% of the employers across the UK. So only a very small percentage will actually pay the levy. So we will concentrate later on in the session about non-levy paying employers and how some of that is going to work. New information has come out recently which tells us more about the process that employers are going to have to go through to actually access the levy if they do pay it. One of the things they're going to be doing is actually declaring the levy themselves via their usual monthly PAYE process that they handle with HMRC. It is the employer's responsibility to make sure that they actually declare the levy to HMRC from the 1st of April next year. And HMRC are going to be publishing levy guidance on that in December of this year. So for any employers that we've got online, look out for that levy guidance, which should be coming to you in December from HMRC. The levy payment for employers will be based on the total amount of earnings subject to Class 1 secondary national insurance contributions. So in some cases that will actually also include pension payments that are subject to Class 1 NIC payments. It will include bonuses and other payments that you make to employees that are similar. The government will add an extra 10% uplift to that levy on a monthly basis. So when you first, as an employer, when you first see your levy in the digital apprenticeship service, it looks very much like a bank account, and it will show you online what money you've put in, and it will also include and show you the 10% uplift that the government is adding to your levy account on a monthly basis. Finally, if you use up your levy amount as an employer, there will be an arrangement for employers to co-invest with the government to have more apprenticeships delivered. We don't know what that co-investment percentage is going to look like. We should know more about that soon. It's been touted as potentially maybe a 50-50, so the government will contribute 50% and the employer will contribute another 50%, enabling you to spend more money on apprenticeships if you've used up your levy on an annual basis. But as I said earlier on, we're looking for more information that the government is actually going to send us, hopefully in the next week. Parliament goes on recess on the 21st of July. They have said that they will publish more information before they go on recess, so that information is imminent. Okay, so the levy payment process will operate on a monthly basis. So there's been questions about this, but it's going to be a monthly payment that you will make via your PAYE, and that monthly amount will show inside your digital apprenticeship service account a month later. So the levy monthly amounts will accumulate in the DAS throughout the year. So as you go throughout, if you're not using that levy amount will build up. Any unused allowance will be carried over to the next month, so each month that money will build up and the government will add their 10% to it. After 18 months, the government will start removing that money on a first in, first out approach. So your first month's money, if you haven't used it, will be removed from your levy account 18 months later, and the government will use that elsewhere within the apprenticeship system to support other apprenticeships and other companies that may wish to do more. Employers will also be able to register to set up an account on the Digital Apprenticeship Service from January 2017, and the Skills Funding Agency will be issuing guidance for that at the same time to enable employers to register. Non-levy paying employers will be required to contribute to the cost of apprenticeship delivery via a government co-funding arrangement. Again, that information is soon to be confirmed. We should get information about that before the 21st of July. So the Digital Apprenticeship Service, there'll be guidance for employers to register from January. The actual service itself looks very much like a bank account, and I'll talk more about that later on in the session. Non-levy paying employers will not be able to register on the Digital Apprenticeship Service from January, but there will be an enablement for them to register on DAS, probably we think from 2018 onwards. They'll be able to access the Digital Apprenticeship Service. The DAS will give a lot of other information apart from the levy, but we'll talk more about that later on in the session. So we'd like to just ask another poll question now, if we can. How well developed is your understanding of the levy and the Digital Apprenticeship Service? Do you have some idea but not fully formed? Have heard of it but know very little? Have a very well developed idea and understand all there is to know? What is the levy and the Digital Apprenticeship Service? Okay, thank you everybody. I'm just going to ask Kelly to go back a few slides because I think we skipped a slide at the beginning. I'm having problems sending my slides further on. So Kelly, could you go back just 2 or 3 slides please for me? I can't seem to do that. One more. We're missing a slide. There. Okay, so these are the upcoming announcements that you can expect in July and October. So the July ones are the imminent ones, so watch out for these because the Skills Funding Agency and BIS should be publishing them on their website, certainly in the next week or so. We'll get provisional funding bands, so that's a maximum amount of funding available for each apprenticeship from the 1st of April 2017. the provisional level of the government support that's going to be available for non-levy paying employers, the provisional level of incentive that employers may get for 16 to 18-year-old apprenticeships, the provisional funding amounts for English and Maths training in apprenticeships, because the English and Maths funding that providers get will be separate from the funding cap that they will receive for delivery of the apprenticeship, eligibility rules that set who employers are able to spend apprenticeship funding on and where, and there will also be more information on who can provide apprenticeship training and how employers can set up their organisation to deliver apprenticeship training. So that will be information on how employers can turn themselves into a provider and potentially look to register themselves as an apprenticeship provider on the new Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations. And in October, we should get the final levels of funding for government support for the 16 to 18 payments, for the English and Maths payments, and that's for everything starting from the 1st of April 2017. So we'll get full draft funding and eligibility rules, and also some performance management and audit arrangements for the apprenticeships, and that will come in October 2016. And then, as I said earlier, in December 2016, HMRC will publish their levy guidance, which will be very important for finance teams. So, just moving on to the final slide on the apprenticeship levy update. So, Skills Funding Agency and BIS are intending to change the arrangements for funding of apprenticeship frameworks in preparation for April the 1st, 2017. So there are several things that they are doing to get ready for the new arrangements. One of those is to put all the current apprenticeship frameworks into a funding band. So as providers will know, if you're delivering apprenticeship frameworks currently, they have a funding amount attached to them, which you go to the Learning Aim Reference Service to access. That tells you how much you will get funded for that framework and how much your Maths and English funding will be. But from the 1st of April, all frameworks will be put into a funding band. Now you'll notice there's a terminology change there. The government, that's BIS and the Skills Funding Agency, the Department of Business Innovation and Skills and the Skills Funding Agency have been talking about funding caps. They are now starting to talk about funding bands rather than funding caps, which should give you an indication of what we may be moving towards. I think probably the terminology is particularly pertinent, because I think what you will find is that frameworks and standards will be put into a funding band that may well show the upper level limit, that's the maximum amount of government contribution and employer contribution that should be expected to pay for that apprenticeship, but there may also be a lower amount in that band, i.e. the bottom amount that the government, SFA and BIS would expect an employer to contribute towards the delivery of that apprenticeship when they're working with a provider. We're not 100% sure that's going to be the case. When you talk about band, it's very different terminology from a cap, so one can assume that the band will have an upper and lower level. There's a good thing here, because it will hopefully, if they do go for a lower level, stop that swim to the bottom that some employers may be tempted to go for to try and drive apprenticeship funding rates down. So look out for that. That should be announced imminently. So SFA are also removing apprenticeship frameworks at the moment, and they are continuing to do that. There's already been 2 sets of removals, and they are working on a 3rd removal of apprenticeship frameworks at the moment. They are looking at frameworks that have low registration, or where an apprenticeship standard has been developed that replaces the current framework. There are a further 55 apprenticeship frameworks that are up for consultation at the moment for removal in September with 6 months' notice, and that link that you can see at the bottom of this slide, that is the link that takes you to the framework consultation for anybody to feedback to the Skills Funding Agency and the Department of Business Innovation and Skills, BIS, if they do not think that framework should be removed and the reasons why it should not be removed in September. Finally, the government announced recently that providers wishing to deliver apprenticeships from 1st of April onwards will have to register on a completely new Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations. This is different from the current Register of Training Organisations. It will be a new register. And last Friday they did say that imminently they will be publishing a consultation on that register. It will be a very quick consultation. It literally will run till early August, so we should look for the publication of that consultation sometime this week, if not then early next week. It will close in early August, and the first opening of that register will occur in September. We'll go into more detail on that later, but that's a new arrangement for any provider wanting to deliver apprenticeships from 1st of April. So we'd like to do another poll quickly, if we could. How are you currently engaging employers around your future apprenticeship offer? Could you please tick all that apply? That's you're consolidating relationships with existing employers, you're making contacts with employers who are new to apprenticeships, making contact with employers who are likely to be levy players, or you don't know what you're doing about your employer base and your contact with them currently. Okay, thank you everybody. We will feedback the outcomes of these polls later on. I think it's better to move on through the rest of the presentation now so that we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. So, on to the next slide. So in a bit more detail, the Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations. Okay, as a provider, you will not be able to deliver or be funded for apprenticeships if you are not on this new register. It is a separate register to the current Register of Training Organisations. We had a conversation in a meeting with Keith Smith last week, and what he said about this new register is that there will be a strong focus on applicants' capability to deliver high-quality apprenticeships, alongside the applicant's fitness and ability to receive public funding. So the Skills Funding Agency and the Department of Business Innovation and Skills want to raise the bar via increased information requirements, and these requirements have been asked for by employers. So when they open up the register in September, after the consultation, which is going to be published pretty soon, they'll be looking for 3 routes. So that's 3 types of provider that will be delivering apprenticeships from the 1st of April next year. That's main providers, specialist providers, and employer providers. Now, what Keith Smith said by specialist providers, they do not mean subcontractors. They do mean providers that will provide specialist learning or specialist support for apprentices whilst they're on programme. So that could be that they actually provide a specialist service or a specialist type of learning within that apprenticeship, or it could be that they actually are providing a specialist type of apprenticeship. The other thing to be aware of is that Keith did say that main providers, this can be any provider. It doesn't necessarily need to be a current Skills Funding Agency prime provider. It can be a provider that is currently acting as a subcontractor to a prime provider. But obviously, as part of that, when you apply to go on this separate register, there are 4 areas that are going to be tested. Your financial health, due diligence, that's all the questions that the Skills Funding Agency normally ask about your background, who your directors are, all those normal due diligence questions. Quality questions, and as part of that, they will look at things like your Ofsted outcomes. We did question what would happen with a provider that had a grade 4 Ofsted outcome on quality. And what the SFA said was that, obviously, if it's a grade 4, the provider would be unlikely to be accepted onto this new register. However, as we all know, within Ofsted, you can sometimes have a grade 4 overarching outcome, but you may have a grade 1 or 2 for delivery of, say, something like apprenticeships. And the Skills Funding Agency, when assessing applications to this register, will take that into consideration. So even if you had an overarching grade 4, you could potentially still get on the register. He did say that if one of the grade 4s was from leadership and management, they would be unlikely to accept someone. And obviously if the grade 4 was for apprenticeships, they would be very unlikely to accept any applicants onto the register. So let's look at the actual timeline for this register. Any provider wanting to deliver apprenticeships will have to register. So in July 16, imminently, in the next week or 2, they're going to open the consultation. That will close in early August. Then in September, they will have the first opening for that register for applications. That will then close in October. They'll do evaluation of the first set of applications between October and December. And then they will publish the first version of that register in January 2017. At the same time, in January 2017, they will open the register for second round of applications. And then they will close the register in February, and they will publish version 2 of the register in April 2017, just in time for the first move over to the new arrangements for delivery of apprenticeships. Keith also said it's very likely that they will open that register every 3 months thereafter. So there will be a quarterly opening of the register for new providers or providers that have failed the first time round to reapply to become a part of that apprenticeship register. So that's the timeline for the registration of apprenticeship training organisations onto that new register. So, moving on to the digital apprenticeship service, we did actually see a demonstration of the outer form of the digital apprenticeship service last week. What I can tell you is it looks very much like a bank account. There are 4 areas on the first page. We got to see a couple of them. The first one was the financial information. The financial information looked very much like a bank account. It showed money coming in, so you would see the employer's contribution, and then added to that the government contribution of 10%. And then you saw money going out that employers will be spending on delivery of apprenticeships with their providers. One thing that we also got to see is that there will be a free text box on the digital apprenticeship service that will enable providers to sell themselves to employers, to sell their offer and say what they're good at. It will also show, obviously, provider information in terms of Ofsted outcomes, other performance data that employers have asked for. Employers have also asked for potentially a sort of TripAdvisor type process to enable them to feed back comments on provider performance during the lifespan of the apprenticeship contract that they have with their providers. So that information will also potentially show later on, once that TripAdvisor type process has been instigated and starts to be used. I don't think the Skills Funding Agency is 100% sure about that TripAdvisor process, but I think there will be some way for employers to feed back comments on provider performance during the timeline of apprenticeships. So the other thing that the digital apprenticeship service will also show is the percentage of English funds available to the employer to spend on apprenticeships. Because what we have to remember is even though employers are paying the levy, part of that levy will go to the devolved nations. So you will, even though you may, for instance, spend £10,000 a month on your levy, part of that £10,000 is going to end up being spent in Scotland and Wales. So you will not see that full £10,000 as an employer in your English levy account. You will see the percentage of the English funds available to spend. And finally, in real terms, the employers never actually handle that cash. What happens is the cash will still flow to the providers from the SFA via the ILR and the digital apprenticeship service. Once the provider and employer agreed a written agreement between themselves for delivery, if they're a levy-paying employer, they will go back, they'll put that information into DAS, the provider will put that information into their ILR, and then the digital apprenticeship service will make automatic payments to the provider via the digital apprenticeship service for the lifespan of that apprenticeship. So I think most of you will have seen this slide, so I'm not going to concentrate on it for too long, but this is the arrangement that we have. These are the funding caps up until 31st of March 2017. So this is the arrangement that will stay in place for the next 9 months or so. And at the moment, every £1 spent on training by an employer, the government contributes £2 up to the maximum cap, and you can see the 6 caps there. So we've got a 2-for-1, or a 1 in 3 approach to the current funding, and that will remain in place until 31st of March. What will also remain in place are the 6 caps. And additionally, there's those 3 incentive payments that are also available for recruiting a 16 to 18-year-old, for a small business recruiting an apprentice, and for successful completion of that apprenticeship by the apprentice, the employer and the provider. So that arrangement is what stays in place until 31st of March 2017. From 1st of April 2017, we'll have the new arrangements in place, and this is when the Skills Funding Agency start talking about funding bands. And for non-levy paying employers, there will also be the government contribution. That's going to be confirmed, again, imminently, sometime in the next couple of weeks. We've had a leaked ratio, which says it will be 1 in 9, but the SFA would not confirm that last week. So the leaked ratio says it might be a 1 in 9 for non-levy paying employers, but we need to wait for confirmation of that. And the Skills Funding Agency is talking about bands. Now this table that you can see on the slide is very much an example of what things might look like, but this is not definite yet. But I think you'll have an arrangement of funding bands, and you can see the examples down there. You'll have a top of the band, probably have a top of the band amount, and a lower band, and it will be down to the provider and the employer to negotiate within the range of that band for how much the employer is going to pay for each apprenticeship. And it will also, there will also be, hopefully, for non-levy paying employers, then you'll see the contribution. But we need to wait for more information on that. We also know that additionally there will be other incentive information coming out in the next 2 weeks. So from 1st of April, it will change, and we'll look and see what that looks like when the information is published in the next couple of weeks. And I think we will probably look to do more funding webinars later on once we've got more information about this. So we've got a poll question now, which is all around pricing structures for apprenticeships and what you might have done in preparation for the new arrangements. So have you considered a pricing structure for your apprenticeship offer? And if so, how far along are you in developing it? Have you considered it but not yet taken it further? Worked on it currently? What do you mean pricing structure? We have a pricing structure already in place for our new apprenticeship offer. If you could now vote on that poll, that would be really helpful for us. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Okay. So, again, I think most of you will have actually seen this slide. This is an example of how the levy will work, dependent on how much you have as a pay bill as an employer. We've also got a college example there as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. These slides will be sent out, and you'll have plenty of time to have a look at this and see how the levy will work. One thing just to be very clear on is that the allowance that the government has given, which is a £15,000 allowance, is not an amount paid for the employer. It's the percentage amount of allowed pay bill funding before the levy is due to be paid. So, for example, if you look at the college one there, example 3, a levy sum of 0.5% of £20 million pay bill is 100,000. So the allowance of 15,000 is taken away from that 100,000. Therefore, the annual levy payment for that employer or that college would be £85,000 a year. I think one of the things to take into consideration that HMRC has also flagged, and that was flagged last week as part of the Digital Apprenticeship Service presentation, was that obviously the Skills Funding Agency is very aware that on DAS there will need to be a funding calculator, because there are some employers that have seasonal staffing and therefore their pay bill will go up and down. So there will be a calculator on the Digital Apprenticeship Service which will enable employers to look at how much they will actually accumulate over the course of the year, and that funding calculator will also include an arrangement for employers with seasonal staffing, therefore a fluctuating payroll, to also be able to have some view and calculation of how much levy they will pay throughout the course of the year. Because obviously, as the levy is being paid monthly, there may be some months when some employers will not pay any levy at all. And then, for instance, if you're a hospitality and catering employer, you might find that you're paying the levy during the months of June, July, August and September, and you're paying quite a high amount, but during the rest of the month, rest of the year, you're paying a low amount or no levy at all. So that funding calculator will assist employers with that. Okay, so let's have an overview of the levy process to draw down funding. Click again. There you go. So, okay, so 1. The employer recruits and flags apprentice. Now this could be an internal member of staff, or it could be a completely new member of staff. At that point, if the employer is a levy-paying employer, they go onto DAS and they select a provider for initial negotiations to take place. This is when it's sensible for providers to have a pricing schedule in place. Not only does it make you look professional as a provider to have a pricing schedule in place, but it will actually enable you as providers and employers to be very clear about what a provider can and can't do. your financial teams and your curriculum teams can look at the new information that's going to be coming out imminently in the next couple of weeks and look at where you could potentially give discounts, i.e. for economy of scale. If an employer approaches you and says, actually, we want you to deliver 20 apprenticeships for us, that's a much cheaper option than delivering individual apprenticeships, which obviously would have a higher cost. So having sensible pricing schedules in place to assist those negotiations will be a real help for both employers and for providers. Secondly, so the provider-employer agree, and then you sign a written agreement. That written agreement is the legal contract between yourselves as the employer and yourselves as the provider. It is the main form of contract which will enable you to iron out any issues if something goes awry during the lifespan of that particular apprenticeship. So, for example, if the apprentice leaves, if the employer has to make redundancies unexpectedly, all of that information needs to be in your written agreement. At the point that the written agreement is signed, at that point, the employer flags this on the digital apprenticeship service. This prompts the payment schedule to the provider. What it also prompts is for the SFA to issue what they are calling an auxiliary agreement for each contract between the provider and the employer. We don't yet know what that auxiliary agreement will contain. The Skills Funding Agency has not clarified that. I think that it will give rules and regulations that both the provider and employer are expected to adhere to. I think it will probably also include information about the breakdown of funding that the digital apprenticeship service will pay to the provider once the employer has flagged that contract on the digital apprenticeship service. But we'll wait for more information about that from the Skills Funding Agency later on. So there will be some sort of auxiliary agreement issued by the SFA to both the employer and the provider, as well as the written signed legal agreement between the employer and provider once that apprenticeship is due to start. Once that's been done, the provider will then need to establish a learner evidence pack. The learner evidence pack is a single point of reference relating to the training and endpoint assessment of that individual apprentice or apprenticeship. It will cover the audit and Ofsted requirements as well, so that will also cover schemes of work, when you expect the endpoint assessment to take place, potentially who the endpoint assessment organisation is, which you should have agreed with the employer once you at the point of written agreement. You then also set up on the ILR your registration and including the cash contribution from non-levy paying employers. So if you've signed a written agreement with a non-levy paying employer, it is the ILR which will draw down your cash once you receive the cash contribution from the non-levy paying employer, because you do not receive any funding from the government for delivery of an apprenticeship with a non-levy paying employer unless that employer has already contributed the cash up front. And so your payment schedule with the written agreement with non-levy paying employers is also an important aspect of that particular written agreement. And then finally, you get to endpoint assessment when the apprentice reaches the gateway, i.e. they're ready for endpoint assessment. As a provider, you make the final payment to the endpoint assessment organisation via your levy funds. So EPA funding, or payment for funding of EPA, comes from the levy funds. It is the endpoint assessment organisation, the EPA organisation, that certificates the apprenticeship. And then as a provider, you would pay the employer any final outstanding remaining incentives that you also claim from the government. And again, when that government publishes further information in the next week or two, that will give us further information about those final incentives and when they can be paid and at what point during the apprenticeship. So we're going to go for another poll here. This is regarding processes and ensuring funding. How ready are you as providers, your staff and your MIS departments to implement the changes? And if you could tick all that apply, as in fully ready with an implementation plan, aware and preparing an implementation plan, aware but not preparing anything yet, not aware and need briefing, training or support. Okay, so still some work to do there for all providers in readying their MIS teams and staff teams with that bit of work. Okay, so looking at the system, levy paying employers. Their levy is paid into the digital apprenticeship service. They look on the digital apprenticeship service to find their provider that they want to have initial negotiations with. If the initial negotiations go forward, then a price is agreed between the employer and the provider for the cost of each of those apprenticeships that they're going to deliver. The monthly deductions are paid to the provider over the lifespan of that apprenticeship, and they are paid from the digital apprenticeship service to the provider. And then finally, if the employer wants to actually deliver more apprenticeships than their levy will allow, they can top up their levy with a co-investment arrangement with the government. We'll know more about that co-investment arrangement later on. The government will hopefully publish that soon. Non-levy paying employers, it's the employer's own funds that they will put forward, either on the 1 in 9 or the 50/50 or the 1 in 3, we don't know the amount yet. They agree a price and a payment schedule and a written agreement with the provider, and that payment schedule will include when the employer will pay their own funds to the provider to enable the provider to draw down government funding. So that payment schedule as part of the written agreement is very important with non-paying employers to make sure that providers can actually start delivering upfront. The employer is invoiced by the provider, either via BACS or by an invoicing process that you put in place with your finance departments for the amounts that they have agreed to pay as their contribution, and the employer will pay that to the provider at certain points agreed via that payment schedule. And there is a co-investment arrangement with government, and that all happens via the ILR arrangements that the provider has in place. So those are the two dual systems for levy-paying employers and non-levy-paying employers that will go forward from the 1st of April next year. So just some final key dates for actions, just to be aware of. In July, the new register consultation and draft funding information should come out. That's imminent, and that register consultation will run probably till early August. In September, the new register will open for first applications. In October, the new register closes. SFA Biz will publish draft funding rules for the April 2016 onwards, and in December, HMRC will publish the levy guidance for employers. In 2017, version 1 of the register will be published and opened for round 2 of applications, and employers can begin registering on the digital apprenticeship service to set up their funding account. In April, version 2 of the register will be published and the levy starts, and at that point it's likely that the register will open up again for a further round of applications. From April, apprenticeship frameworks will move to the CAP funding, or the band funding that Skills Funding Agency are now using. In April also, all apprenticeship delivery moves to the new arrangements, and from May 17, employers will first see the levy funds for spend on DAS. Sorry, that should say May 2017, not May 7. So that in May 2017, employers will be able to see their first levy funds that will show on their digital apprenticeship service account. And then from 2018, non-levy paying employers will be able to access the digital apprenticeship service account. And that's all the key dates for action going forward that we're aware of at the moment. So, just a final couple of slides. City and Guilds, we're working with a lot of employers and a lot of providers, leading discussions about the new arrangements. We're working with trailblazers, and we are developing new products and services, and we're running events and workshops, and obviously these webinars. There's a lot of up-to-date and helpful information on our website on the link below, including our apprenticeship reform document, which we've just finished updating with any new information. So just as a final poll here, if we can, before we finish up on and move to questions, do you feel you have the information you need to transition your delivery from SACE to the new apprenticeship standards and the new arrangements on 1st of April next year? The answers there are yes, I still have questions, we will still need support, or no, we are not ready. Right, thank you everybody. That's really useful poll feedback. Okay, so that's the slides for today. So I think we can move to questions. I think we've probably got quite a few of them. So I'm just going to hand you over to Belinda. Belinda's going to go through some of the questions that we've had. Hi everybody. And hopefully I'll be able to answer them. Any questions that we can't answer, we will log, and we will do a Q&A that will feed back later on with the slides and the webinar when it's published online.
Okay, thank you, Bryony. So to start off, we had a couple of questions about subcontractors I'll ask two, which I think you can probably answer together. So, where companies are subcontractors, will there be an opportunity for them to join the primary provider list, as we were not previously informed that subcontracts, whether they'd be allowed or not? And then the second question, fairly similar. In fact, you answer that one first, and I'll find the second one because lots are coming in.
Okay, the indications last week from the Skills Funding Agency were that if you are currently a subcontractor but you want to deliver directly to the employers that you may be working with, yes, you will be able to register on the new Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations. Obviously, you will have to go through all of those due diligence requirements, which are going to be quite rigorous. So you need to make sure that as a provider you can meet those requirements to be able to get onto that register. But yes, you will be able to apply.
Okay, thank you. So the second question about subcontracting was, as a subcontractor, we've never had an Ofsted inspection on our own right, so have no grade. So would they use their LEVY grade on the register or something else?
I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that. I think it will be interesting to see what questions the consultation fires out when it publishes in the next couple of weeks. I don't know yet what the consultation will look like. There may be an opportunity for you to ask questions on the consultation. That might be a question that we can ask. Certainly as an organisation, we'll be going on to that consultation, looking at the questions that the Skills Funding Agency and BIS are asking, and looking that hopefully that will give us some idea of what they're looking at going forward. I would assume that if they're saying that subcontractors can apply to be their own deliverer as part of the new arrangements on that Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations, then the Skills Funding Agency will have some arrangements in place for subcontractors that do not yet have an Ofsted outcome.
Lovely, thank you. A few questions about funding bands. Where can I find out what band or qualification will fall within? And then secondly, do we know if they're going to change from the trailblazers that have already been announced?
We don't know that they're going to change, but the information that the Skills Funding Agency and the Department of Business and Innovation and Skills are going to publish in the next week or two, that will tell you what the bands are, and it will also show where the frameworks will be sitting in the bands, and it will also show where the standards will be sitting in the bands. So that information that's coming out in the next couple of weeks is going to be really key for both providers and employers to be able to see how much it's going to cost, or how much that they can charge for delivery of a particular apprenticeship, whether it's a framework or whether it's a standard. So look out for that information in the next couple of weeks, because that will give you the answer to this.
Lovely, thank you. And a few here about co-investment. So we've obviously said 2 to 1. Tony here saying he thought it was set still at 2 to 1, and we've heard rumours about 90%, 10%. And also, will the co-investment be the same for non-levy payers as levy payers once they have once they've used up all the money in their levy account?
We don't know. Again, the information that's going to be published next week will give us those answers. So there's been all sorts of ideas bandied around. There's been the 1 in 9. There's been the remaining 1 in sort of 2 to 1 arrangement, and there's been a 50-50 banded around for co-investment with any levy paying employers that have used up their entire levy. We don't have the answers. We literally have to wait for that information that's going to come out later on this week or early next week, before Parliament goes on recess on the 21st of July anyway. They have promised that they will publish it before then.
Okay, thank you. And do you know what is happening with traineeships? Are they going to follow the same levy process or remain different?
We don't know what's happening with traineeships yet. We do know that there's going to be some work done on traineeships. The feelings at the moment is that traineeships need to be rejigged slightly to assist with the arrangements, getting people ready to go towards an apprenticeship. One thing I think to keep in mind is obviously the Sainsbury review came out earlier on this week, and that is talking about the new technical and professional educational pathways, which will lead into apprenticeships or into an academic further education or into a job. And at that point, I think traineeships will change, but for the moment, traineeships will be funded from your normal adult education budget. And we don't know the arrangements. We'll know the funding rules when they come out in October, and there may be some more information about this next week when the government publishes the information that I've just mentioned earlier.
Lovely, thank you. Will a provider be able to negotiate the length of an apprenticeship, or will this be dictated to us? So this is asked by Teresa, and the reason she asked that question is because some students may require a little longer and move at different paces. However, it seems that it's measured on time.
I think with standards, normally they say, on most standards when they come out, that the minimum amount of time that the apprentice must spend in learning must be 12 months or 15 months. If an apprentice needs longer, that's definitely down to you to negotiate with your employer. So if the employer's taken on an apprentice and your assessment of that apprentice is actually they're going on to a 12-month apprenticeship, but it's probably going to be 15 or 16 months for this to complete, those discussions are the ones that you need to have with the employer when you put in place the written agreement covering that particular apprenticeship or apprenticeships. So that discussion is really going to be down to your initial negotiations with the employer on how long you think it will take the apprentice to complete. But they've got to stay on programme for the minimum amount of time specified in either the framework or the standard.
Thank you. So some questions about funding for maths and English, which is currently £471. Is that likely to continue?
There will definitely be separate funding for maths and English outside of the levy, but we don't know the amount for that. Again, that is part of what's going to be published in the next week or two. So that information the government's publishing is going to give us draft funding amounts for English and maths.
Thank you. If a provider is not successful on the Register of Apprentice Training Organisations the first time, will there be enough time to put in a second application before the close?
Well, the way that the SFA has stated that the register is going to work is that they'll open it every 3 months, very much like they do with the Register of Training Organisations. Then they will close it, then they will evaluate the applications. Once they've evaluated, and they will publish a version which says all of these organisations got through to be on this register, and they will inform organisations that didn't make it through, and you'll then be able to go into the next opening of the register and apply again. So there won't be time within one opening to actually apply and be told and then go back and reapply. You will have to wait for the next opening. And as I mentioned earlier, they're going to open the register every 3 months or so. So the first opening will be in September, it will close in October, they'll publish version 1 in December, then they'll open it again in January, they will close it in February, and they'll publish version 2 of the register in April. And then they'll open it again in April, they'll close it in May, and you should get a third version of the register probably in June, July. So there will be opportunities to keep on trying to apply to get on, but you won't be able to go in and apply, be told that you failed, and then go in during that first opening and reapply. You'll have to, because they will close it and then go through all the applications in one go.
Thanks, Bryony. And can you talk through the requirements for providers to enable them to register in September?
Well, I mean, it's as I said on that slide earlier on. They're going to look at financial. They're going to look at your financials. They're going to ask you due diligence questions. So that's going to be about your capability, your background and your history and delivery of apprenticeships. They're going to look at your quality. So they're going to be looking at your outcomes on apprenticeships. They're going to be looking at your Ofsted. And I can't remember what the final thing was on the slide. There were 4 things on the slide. Let me just have a look. Yes, so your readiness to deliver. So it's those 4 aspects that they'll look at. We don't know exactly the questions that the register is going to ask. I think going on to the consultation when it opens, which is imminent, that should be either this week or next week, having a look at the questions that the Skills Funding Agency and BIS are asking will give you some idea of what you need to get ready to go on that register. If there's any provider out there that thinks they need support with getting ready to go on that register, I've already talked to our teams internally, and I'm sure we can give you some help with that. But yes, that's all the information we were given by the SFA last week. So it's financial health, due diligence, quality, and readiness to deliver. And look out for it when the consultation comes out next week, because that should give you a better idea of what sort of things they're going to be asking for. Also, that consultation is very much about you as providers feeding back if you think there's something unreasonable or impossible to achieve inside that register application. So the consultation will give you a chance to feed back if you think there's something that isn't going to work or is going to be difficult to achieve.
Thank you. And also then just to clarify that providers will still need to register via this registration scheme in September to continue delivering the existing SACE frameworks as well as
yes, it's to deliver any apprenticeships post 1st of April next year. If you're not on that register, you will not be able to deliver. So it's going to be very important that everybody gets through either round 1 or round 2 if you want to continue delivering past 1st of April next year. If you don't get on by 1st of April, it means you will have a gap in your delivery until you can get yourself on that register. Obviously, any apprenticeships that you start before the 31st of March next year, you will be able to continue to deliver on the current funding arrangements, which means you will still get income from the Skills Funding Agency for the apprenticeships that you are continuing to deliver that you've registered before 31st of March. But you won't be able to register any new apprenticeships until you are on that register, and therefore you won't get any income from your employers until you're on that register, and then you can go forward and deliver.
Thank you. A few questions about being an employer provider. One just saying, can you clarify how to be both an employer and a provider? And then the second one saying we are already an employer provider and setting up on the RoATO, but is it still worth doing that with the forthcoming RoATO?
Yes. You have to be on the RoATO to get on the Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations. So you will have to be on 2 registers. It's going to be 2 separate registers. So if you're applying to go on RoATO, keep going through that process because you won't be able to register on the Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations unless you are on RoATO. And I'm assuming that some of the information that you need that's needed for the Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations will also be taken from RoATO. In respect of being an employer provider, you need to be on both these registers to enable yourself to actually deliver your own apprenticeships. I'm not quite sure what else that they might need to know about that. I think it's just you need to be on those registers to be able to go forward and be your own provider as an employer. So watch out for the information that the government's going to publish on that. It'll be on the BIS website or on the Skills Funding Agency website, but I think that what we will do is once we know that information has been published, we'll probably put something up on our website and we'll flag it. So if you're registered on our website for apprenticeship information in our preferences service, then you should get information about that. So if you're not registered on our website for preferences, go in and register on our preference service for apprenticeship information, and once we put that information up, you'll get it.
Okay, lovely. And another one from an employer who employs all apprentices via an ATA. So
Right.
Who will access the funding from DAS and who will engage with the training provider?
Good question. We don't have a lot of information about how ATAs are going to work going forward as yet. So I'm not going to answer that one because I don't want to give out false information, but we will ask questions. I don't know whether that's going to be in the information that's coming out in the next week or so, or whether that's going to be in the funding rules that are going to be published in October. I would imagine it's more likely to be in the funding rules, so I think we may have to wait for October to find out more about that. But in the interim, we'll ask that question and see if we can get any information.
Lovely, thank you. So question here, as an employer, we may have a 3-year apprenticeship. 2 years of that may be delivered by a provider and a year assessment on the job. So how would the funding be split?
Again, I think that's down to your written agreement that you have with your provider when you do the initial negotiations about how much you're actually going to give the provider out of your digital apprenticeship service account. I have asked the question recently of BIS about employers that are actually delivering quite a bit of the apprenticeship, particularly if you're a levy paying employer, because obviously if you are delivering quite a bit of that apprenticeship, for example, if you're delivering something like a nursing qualification inside the nursing assistant standard, you may well be delivering that qualification and spending quite a bit of money on doing that, but you can't actually get that money out of the levy because the levy money goes to the provider. So we fired a question at BIS and the SFA saying, is there going to be, under the eligibility rules for what the levy can be spent on, an opportunity for an employer to be able to invoice, for instance, the provider to get money back for the delivery that they're doing? But we don't have an answer to that yet, and I'm not sure that BIS and SFA really have quite grasped that that could be an issue for some employers going forward when they're doing a lot of the delivery. So we're waiting on information, and when we do more webinars later on in the year, hopefully we'll have answers to that question and we'll be able to answer it then.
Okay, thank you. So will employers now have to contribute to 16 to 18-year-old apprenticeships? You have said that for non-levy payers the process starts with the employer payment, but is there a danger that SMEs will not buy into apprenticeships if they have to pay cash up front? Could providers trade off payments for 16 to 18, maths and English, etc.?
I think it depends very much on what the contribution amount is that the government asks of the non-levy paying employers. If it's a 1 in 9, that could actually be a very small amount that the employer needs to pay up front to get that apprenticeship going. So I think we need to wait and see what that percentage is yet, because I think the government will do everything they possibly can to encourage the smaller employers, those that aren't paying the levy, to continue taking on apprenticeships. Otherwise, they're not going to meet their 3 million target, and that's a hard target for this government. So I think we need to wait for those percentages and see what they are, and see if they have done something to encourage the smaller, non-levy paying employers to still engage with the apprenticeship process. In respect of trade-off, no, there's not really going to be any trade-off, because the only way that you as a provider can draw down funding via the ILR is to be able to show via auditable proof, that's via an invoice or a back transfer, that your employer has paid their contribution up front or paid their contributions during the lifespan of that apprenticeship. So I don't know how you would work a trade-off for that. It's not really going to work, otherwise you won't be able to draw down your government funding. So that arrangement that we have at the moment with frameworks, for example, where actually it may be a 50-50 because you've recruited a 19-year-old apprenticeship, but the employer may be doing payment in kind of some sort, that's no longer going to be feasible past the 1st of April next year.
Thank you. A few more questions about subcontracting. Will apprenticeship providers still be able to subcontract to any extent at all? If so, will subcontractors need to be on the register?
Yes, I think subcontractors will still need to be on the register. Subcontracting, I think, will still be available from what we're hearing. There'll be more about this in the funding rules next year, particularly as it may well be that actually the employer comes to you as the main prime provider and says, actually, we want you to be our apprenticeship deliverer, but also we want you to use this subcontractor over here to deliver a specialist aspect of this particular apprenticeship. So yes, subcontracting will still have to exist because employers may well ask for it.
And is there any indication that a provider will need to have a pricing structure in place to actually register?
No, there's going to be no need for a pricing structure. It's just a sensible move on behalf of on your behalf as providers. One, because it makes you look professional. If you've got an employer approaching you, you already know what your pricing structure is and what your fees charge basis is. You know what economy of scales you can get for delivery of 5, 10, 20, 25, 50 apprenticeships. But no, there's no requirement for you to have a pricing structure in place prior to applying to go on the apprenticeship register.
Thank you. And do you know whether the cash contribution, be it 2-to-1 or 9-to-1, would need to be paid all up front? We have a lady who says she has apprenticeships in beauty and is aware that the salon employers wouldn't be able to afford to put all of that money up front.
No, there's no need to do it all up front. You can arrange that pricing schedule in a way that meets you as the provider and the employer's needs. It's really down to you to agree. Obviously, for providers, you may need some upfront, depending on what the apprenticeship is, to enable you to initiate delivery. But actually, that pricing schedule is totally down to what you agree with your employer. Just remember, as providers, you can't draw down any government funding until you've got evidence that your employer has actually paid you money. You put that evidence and information into your ILR, and that immediately draws down funding from the Skills Funding Agency. But the pricing schedule and when the employer pays you that money is totally down to the arrangements between you and your employers. It doesn't need to be all up front. It could be once every 3 months, once every 6 months, it could be every month.
Thank you. Do we know if there are any plans to implement the register in Wales?
No, Wales and Scotland currently have their own arrangements for delivery of apprenticeships and their own funding arrangements. In most cases, Scotland and Wales have what are called outcome agreements. I know that Scotland has recently approached the government with a view to discussing the apprenticeship levy and how that might work and how they might rationalise arrangements, but that's going to be some distance in the future because they currently have very different arrangements.
And similar question, if an employer pays the levy based in England and has branches in Wales, how will this influence Welsh providers?
Well, it won't initially influence Welsh providers because, as I said, Wales very much will spend its apprenticeship levy in their own way on their own apprenticeship arrangements, which are different from England. So I think going forward in the future, there's going to be lots of discussions about how that might work. We'll also know the percentages that both Scotland and Wales will get, I would imagine, at some point later on this year. But Wales will spend that money in a way that meets their current arrangements for the foreseeable future.
And there's been a couple of questions about contracts. Will there be any exemplar contracts or guidelines?
Not that we've heard so far. One thing I have said to all the employers and providers that I've run workshops with recently is it would be a sensible thing for you to have someone who is a specialist legal background in contracting, just to make sure that your contract between yourself and your employer, if you're a provider, and yourself and your provider, if you're an employer, is safe and keeps you safe, whether you're a provider or employer. It's just a sensible thing to make sure you've had someone cast an eye legally over that contract to make sure that it's a watertight legal document for you. But neither BIS or the Skills Funding Agency have said anything about exemplar agreements, because they see that written agreement as a contract between yourself and the employer. Therefore, it's your responsibility and the employer's responsibility to put that in place and make sure that it is watertight for you. They may do something later on in the year, but nobody has mentioned that, and I think it would be quite a difficult thing to do, because reality is it's a legal contract between an employer and provider. Therefore, for another third party to have some say in it would make that third party potentially partially responsible, and I don't think either SFA or BIS would want to be in that position, and certainly no other body would want to be in that position. I'm sure there are a lot of legal firms out there that are rubbing their hands knowing that you're going to have to be going to them asking advice about contracting.
Lovely. We unfortunately have run out of time, and very sorry because there are a lot of questions that we haven't had time to get to. Please rest assured, lots of you have asked, we will be sending out a copy of the slides. We'll also be putting together an FAQ document answering as best we can all of the unanswered questions, and also repeating those questions we have answered, so you've got them on your records. And we'll also be sending out a recording of the webinar that you can share with colleagues.
Thank you, everybody. I hope that was helpful. Any feedback you can give, because we're about to send out a feedback survey, is really helpful for us, because it makes sure that whatever we put in the next webinar is as relevant and pertinent as it can be. So please do feel free to give very honest and constructive feedback to enable us to make sure we get the next webinar right if there's something that we've missed out in this. Thank you very much. I hope today was useful for you.